The Global Troop Resource, trying to put 1,000 skills into every troop's backpack. Welcome to the Troop Resource Photography Merit Badge class, Part 1. I'm Coach Scott. Let's jump right in. We have two goals of photography. The first is to have fun, and the second, of course, is to take good pictures. So, we're going to play a game as we get started, and the game is called What's the Matter with This Picture? All right. Now, you should all take yourselves off of mute because the rules are I want you to shout out the answer as soon as you know it. Okay. Good. Looks like everybody's off of mute. All right. Here comes the first picture. I want you to tell me what's the matter with this picture.
He's green.
Oh, he's green. He's green.
That's right.
He's green. I got
green. Awesome. Absolutely right. Ready? How about this one?
He's burnt.
He's orange and he's tinted.
Orange. Absolutely correct. He is orange. Here we go. Ready?
It's too blurry. It's blurry.
It's blurry. That's right. Okay.
Got it. I got that one. That's mine.
We are going to talk about the science behind this picture a little bit. All right.
Well, aren't the cars just moving?
Well, they're doing more than just moving, and we're going to get into that.
The camera is also moving.
That is
the camera is
correct.
moving as well.
Somebody knows their camera technique. That is correct. All right, you
well,
ready for this one?
I just know, like, when something's moving and I take a picture of it, it comes up blurry.
That is exactly correct. All right, ready for this next one?
Yeah.
They're trying to take a picture of the background, but it's taking a picture of the foreground.
That is correct. So what they were doing here is they had their depth of field or their focus set improperly, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. All right, here's another.
Eyes are red.
Eyes are green.
That's right.
Yeah.
We got the devil baby right here. All right. Now, here's another one. Ready?
The flash was on it.
It's
Flash.
That is correct. This was taken with a flash, and it was too close to the subject, and that whited out his entire face. Now, here is a tougher one. You ready for this?
Take yourself off mute.
It's at night, so the picture's too dark.
It's a horse, and the horse.
It's too black. You can't see anything besides the horse.
You can't see the wagon. You can only see the horse.
That is absolutely correct.
I like horses.
Yeah, horses are great.
I have this cowboy game where I have a horse.
Okay, that's fantastic. All right, now this next one is a tough one. All right, you're gonna have to look carefully on this one.
Yeah, there's a fishing pole coming out of their head.
Yes, that's exactly right. They didn't look at the background.
I thought that was like a tower in the background.
Yeah,
Hold on.
well, there's a tower.
I thought it was a tower.
And there's a fishing pole, exactly. So it's the fishing pole that I'm mostly concerned with. But yes, that's correct. Now here's another tough one. I might have to flip between two of these photos so you understand what's the matter with this next one. Ready? Here we go.
It's dark.
There's nothing wrong with that one.
Yeah.
It's too dark. Like,
well, someone says dark. Dark isn't exactly the answer.
Yeah, dark is okay. Don't be.
This is what they call not having any contrast. The colors don't pop. Like, take a look at that one. How red that cooler is. And take a look at the red on this gentleman's protection. Very
he is
very
washed out.
Gentleman. I have a horse here.
All right, ready? I think this might be the last one.
They're playing soccer. That's what's wrong with
Far away.
They're playing
Too
soccer.
far away.
Yeah, too far.
Yeah,
That is correct. You can't see what's going on. You can see just a tiny ball in there, and that's about it. Fantastic. You guys did great. So that's the end of the game. Now, some of these problems are solved through science.
Artistic.
And some of these problems are solved through artistic technique. And we're going to talk about the science today.
Switch over.
And we are going to talk about the artistic technique next week.
I got to mute myself.
If you are using a camera like this one right here, you are both a scientist and an artist. If you are using a camera like this one or like this one, then you are primarily an artist. There are some apps out there which allow you to adjust your shutter speed and your film speed and things like that, in which case you'd be a scientist and an artist as well. Now, all your cameras are okay. No matter what camera you have, you're going to be able to complete this and do a great job, so don't worry about that. We are going to talk about the science and the art of photography. Today we're talking about the science, and the next session we will be talking about the art. Now, there are parts of these big digital SLR cameras, okay? We're going to talk today about the lens, an aperture, a mirror, a shutter, the CCD or film, and the viewfinder or display screen. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do I need to know all about this big professional camera if I'm going to be using my phone to take pictures? And the answer is because your phone, if you actually start to use it on a more professional basis, is going to use the terms that are used in the big cameras. So now granted, an iPhone just with the phone camera isn't going to give you all these options. But if you buy another more professional app, you're going to be able to adjust the shutter speed, and you're going to be able to adjust the aperture, and you're going to be able to adjust the film speed, etc. And then one day, if you decide you want to graduate to a more professional camera, especially if you choose a career in photography, you're going to need to know what these different parts of the camera do. The lens sits in front of everything, and you use it to focus. And this is the lens part right here. Then, right behind the lens, where this red arrow is pointing, is called the aperture ring. And the aperture is like a device that's like this, and then it can get to make a small hole, and then it can make a large hole. And you can see that right here. Here's an aperture almost all the way closed. Notice that hole is nice and tiny. And then you've got an aperture here, which is wide open. And you use the aperture to control how much light reaches the film or the CCD, which is also called a charged coupled device. You're also going to use your aperture to control the depth of field. You remember that bicycle and the bride and groom picture? Well, they obviously had their depth of field too small if they wanted both the bicycle and the bridal party in focus. All right, so then there's the mirror. Sits behind the lens and behind the aperture, and the light is going to come in through the lens, through the aperture, and then it's going to hit the mirror right here. Now, before you press down on your shutter release, the light is going to bounce off the mirror up through a prism right here. You should know prism from your science classes. And then it goes out. Come on, mouse. Where are you? There it goes. Come out through the viewfinder into your eyeball over here. Now, when you press your shutter release, this mirror is going to flip up, and it's going to expose this part right here, which is going to be your film or your CCD. So the mirror allows what's called through the lens viewing, and then it gets out of the way when you want to take the picture. Now, most of you aren't going to be using these little digital cameras, but sometimes digital cameras that are not phones, they have a mirror, and sometimes they don't have a mirror. But when you hear a big professional camera go click clack, that is the mirror flipping up and then flipping back down, or it's the mirror and the actual shutter opening. And this is what a shutter looks like, okay? Here's your shutter, and it sits in front of the film or the CCD. That's the shutter closed. And here you can see that the shutter is open. So the light would come through the lens, through the aperture, underneath the mirror, through the shutter, and hit the film or the CCD device. And then, of course, the film accepts and holds the image, or the CCD device accepts and holds the image. Hi, I'm Coach Scott, and if you've been a loyal viewer of the Global Troop Resource for the past few years, you've probably guessed that we broadcast from a home-based studio. That said, we're preparing for a future where we'd like to take our show on the road. Our plan is to start by visiting other troops on the East Coast and broadcast in person from scout camps and scout reservations. If you'd like to be on our show or to see our plans, visit globaltroopresource.com. That's globaltroopresource.com. Now, back to the show. All right, so with some of the small handheld digital cameras, the image goes through the lens directly to the CCD, and there's no aperture, and there's no shutter, and everything is computer controlled. Okay, so you can see here, they probably have a viewfinder up here, but it never actually goes through the lens of the camera. And here, it's no real viewfinder. It goes through the tiny little lens that's on the camera, behind the camera here, and then electronically is displayed. All right, so with digital cameras, the memory card holds the image, and with your iPhone, the iPhone's memory holds the image. All right, so there's a difference then between film camera and digital camera. And if you're an old antique person like I am who used to use film requires what they call chemical processing. You didn't just get to see it. You had to take your pictures, and then you had to pray that you had this shot, because you didn't see your pictures until, well, when it was early, it was a week later. Then we had Kodak have these 1-hour photo booths, and you could get it to see in an hour later. Nowadays, you get to see everything all immediately, which is fantastic, especially when you're doing things like shooting a wedding and the bride blinks her eyes and you don't get a good shot, and then you don't get paid. So digital cameras are just absolutely wonderful to be able to see your images right away. On film, you could not electronically edit your pictures. You had to get it developed, and then you'd pay extra to get it put on a DVD for you, and then you could edit those if you had an editor. Every time you added film to your camera, you had to replace your film every 24 or 36 shots, depending on how many was on the roll of film. And then there was something called an ISO or an ASA, which is your film speed. And that was actually controlled by the film. So if you shot at 64 ASA outside, and then you shot 500 film or 400 film on the inside lighting, you actually had to change your film out. Now today you get to change it right on the camera, which is pretty cool. I highly recommend that if you really want to get into photography, that you learn the science behind it, and maybe even go out and get an app that takes photos that allows you to control some of this, because then you'll really be able to see what's going on.
Is the scientist is that like the sharpness and the contrast? Is that scientist or is that artist?
That well
Like
depends on how you're controlling it. If you're controlling it in post-production, means you took the picture and now you're manipulating it. Now you're really being an artist, because you're looking at it and you're going, not quite bright enough. Let's move this slider. Oh, that looks good. So that's art.
Yeah.
Science is understanding when you take the photo that if you want an action shot and you want to freeze it in midair, that you're going to need to have a faster shutter speed, which is going to impact your aperture, because you'll need your aperture probably a little wider open to get more light in to do what you want to do. On your SLRs, you're going to have a bunch of dials and a bunch of meters and things of that nature on your camera, but these are the controls over here that control sort of the science portion of your camera. Here, if you have a dial and you see this little red symbol right here, it's just a pointer. If that's pointing at your A, that means you have aperture priority. That means you set the aperture and the camera will automatically set the shutter speed to take the best picture. Okay, this is when you want to set your own depth of field, and we'll get into that in just a moment. If you set it to S, that means you're setting it to shutter priority, which means you set the shutter speed and the camera will automatically set the aperture to give you the best picture, or what it thinks is the best picture. The M means manual, which means you set both the aperture and the shutter speed. That's when you're getting to be a real scientist there. I generally don't use that anymore. On my old cameras, I had to do that all the time. P means program, which is a learning experience. So you set it to P, and your camera will set your shutter and it'll set your aperture, but it shows you on screen what it's doing so that you get an idea of, oh, okay, now it's pretty bright out, so it's setting the aperture to a small aperture, or it's an inside picture, so it's setting the shutter speed to a much longer shutter speed so I can get more light on my film or my CCD. And then, of course, you've got these little images if you're taking close-up of flowers, if you're taking distance pictures of mountains. Here's a nighttime picture. That's a little man with a moon next to him. Here's a portrait shot, and here's a sports shot. And each of those will adjust your camera so that you don't really have to know the science, but you know the environment you're in. So for instance, if you set it to the little man who's running, doing sports, it's going to set you to a very fast shutter speed so it can freeze the action, so you don't have to know anything about that. All right, so we're going to talk about aperture and f-stops. Does anybody here know what an f-stop is? No. Okay. Your f-stop is a number that indicates how big your aperture is. Remember, your aperture is this little thing behind the lens that leaves a small hole like this, a middle hole like this, or a large hole like this for all the light to come through. And generally, you've got aperture settings of things like f16, f11, f8, f5.6, f4, f2.8. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why it's called an f-stop? Well, the reason it's called an f-stop is because it's a fraction, all right? Now, if you take f16, if you made that a fraction by putting a 1 over it, 1/16th, or f4, which is 1/4, which do you think is bigger? Matt, give me a guess. Which is bigger, 1/16th or 1/4? 1/4, exactly. If you cut a pizza into fourths, you'd have some pretty big slices. If you cut a pizza into 16 slices and took 1/16th of that, you'd have a thin slice, right? So it's a little bit confusing in that the larger the number, the smaller the aperture, because that's really the larger the denominator of your fraction. So why should you care? If you want something that is both near and far in focus, then you keep your aperture really small, all right? This is the physics of light. All right, if you want the foreground and or the background blurry, then you make your aperture bigger. All right, then you're going to keep your subject within this field of focus, or AKA depth of field. So this is what it might look like. Here's a depth of field comparison. Here is f5.6, all right? Remember, that's a big opening. Small number, big opening. And notice on this flower right here that the flower is in focus, but the background is not. The background's all out of focus. So you use a big aperture to get either your foreground or your background out of focus, but keep your subject in focus. Here's another one, f8, slightly smaller aperture, and you notice that the flower's in focus and the background's just in a little bit more focus than the picture above it. And then lastly, f22, it's a tiny little aperture, and you'll see the flower's in focus and the background is even in more focus than the ones above it. Now, the background's not entirely in focus because it's falling outside of the depth of field, outside of the depth of focus. So you'd have to change your focus in order to get both the foreground and the background in focus, and use your aperture as small as possible. Anybody confused by that science? Great. Thank you for shaking your head there, Matt. All right. So here we've got some depth of field examples. Who wants to tell me a little bit about this example right here? How about you, Ethan?
So the one, like out of the two pianos,
Yep.
the one on the right has a smaller aperture because you can see more of the background.
Yes, you are awesome.
And the
That
one
is
on the
exactly
left is
correct.
bigger.
That is correct. Good. Now everybody should see that here some of the keys are a little out of focus. Here some of the keys are out of focus. And those keys are in focus. And here all the keys all in focus. Next picture right here. Robbie, tell me about that one.
It has like a middle aperture
Right?
because you can see some of the background, but not all of it.
Okay. It might actually even have a large aperture, because can you tell what's in the background? Is it bushes? Is it trees? What is it?
I don't know.
Now, you don't know. So it's probably got a pretty big aperture to keep all of that so out of focus that you can't even tell what it is.
Okay.
Great. Awesome. All right. And then this last photo right here. Owen.
It has a larger aperture because you really can't. Well, I guess it could have a medium because you can sort of see what's in the background, but
Right.
it's mainly focused on the baseball, so I guess it's medium.
Absolutely right. It's sort of an awesome shot. And I'm guessing that the photographer might have been taking a picture of the pitcher and had his depth of field not set properly so that the pitcher's out of focus and the ball is in focus. So awesome. Good answer. All right. So why are these people blurry, and what would you do to correct it?
He said make the aperture larger.
If you make the aperture larger, then you're going to get things in the foreground and the background out of focus. So it's just the opposite of that. Make your aperture smaller, or change your focus on the focus ring so your depth of field changes or your focus changes. All right, good try. All right, so puzzle me this, guys. You're indoors. This gets complicated. Why you got to know the science. The lighting is not great. You want near and far in focus. Why is this scenario difficult? Who wants to guess?
It's dark.
It's dark, which means what?
There isn't going to be as much light to be focused with the aperture.
Correct. What it is that in order to get enough light in to hit the film, you'd need a big aperture, right? You got to have a big aperture in order to let enough light in. But the problem with a big aperture is what?
It doesn't get everything in focus.
That is correct. So that's why that scenario is difficult. Good answer. Thank you, Aiden. So again, if you're using some of the big cameras and you rotate your wheel for aperture priority, then what you'll do is you'll use the ring that's right behind the lens to set your aperture. And again, you'll set it on a fractional level. And we went over which is which. Now, shutter speed. Remember down here, this is an open shutter. And when it was closed, it sort of looked like this. And when the shutter opens, it goes like that, and lets just enough light in for the film to accept the light. And the faster it goes, and then some of them it goes, and you don't even see it open and close because it moves so fast. So we've got all kinds of shutter speeds. We've got B, 1S, 1/2 S, 1/4 S. Anybody have any idea what the S's mean?
Second.
Seconds. That's exactly right. So you can set your shutter to 1 second, to 1/2 a second, to 1/4 of a second. And those, as far as cameras are concerned, are really slow. Then you get into these others where you can do 1/60th of a second, 1/25th of a second, up to 1/1000th of a second. Now, the low ones, 30 and below, you're going to need a tripod for, because it's so slow that if you move the camera, your picture's going to be blurry, because it has the shutter open for such a long time that a movement of the camera will actually impact how the image is retained by the film or the CCD. The faster ones you can do handheld without any problems. Now, notice that these are fractions too. 1/2 a second, 1/4 a second, etc. Now, why do you think that your aperture is called an f-stop? Well, imagine you had something set, and I told you, Aiden, set your camera to 1/4. What would you say to me? 1/4 what? 1/4 aperture or 1/4 shutter speed? Right?
Yeah.
So that's why they call the aperture an f-stop, and they talk about fractionals in shutter speed. All right, so I got my camera set to 1/64th. That's not an aperture. You know that without even me saying I've set my shutter speed. Great, awesome. Here's a tough one. The B. Anybody have a guess what B means? Oh, Arlen, there you are.
Hi.
Do you know what the B means in shutter speed? You and I are old enough to know this.
Is it a bulb?
That's exactly right. All right. And bulb doesn't mean the little flash bulbs that we used to have. If you've ever seen, any of you scouts have ever seen in the doctor's office, the old-fashioned blood pressure cuffs, where they grab this bulb and they go psh, 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 to blow the cuff up on your arm. Well, they used to actually attach something like that to the camera, and you could squeeze it with the bulb and hold it open for as long as you wanted. And then when you release, the shutter would close. So Arlen wins the prize tonight. Fantastic. All right. Now, here's another question. Now that we've gone through these, which is faster? 1/16 or 1/500th? How about you, Matthew?
I'm pretty sure 1/16 would be faster.
Okay. Well, if I have something and it's 1/16 of a second long, or something that's 1/500th of a second long, think about that. If I sliced my pizza into 16 slices, and I sliced my pizza into 500 slices,
It would be 1/500.
that's right. Which could you eat faster? Right, exactly. These are fractions as well. Well, we're at the end of our 30 minutes, so be sure to watch our next video where we'll cover shutter speed, film speed, and more. See you next time. The Global Troop Resource, trying to put 1,000 skills into every troop's backpack.